Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. Growing up, our house seemed to transform every December. The windows glowed with warm lights, the scent of cinnamon and pine drifted through every room, and my mother spent weeks decorating every corner until it looked like a scene from a holiday movie. For years, I believed Christmas was about family, love, and forgiveness. The Christmas when I was 20, taught me otherwise. That year, I arrived at my parents' house carrying a secret everyone already knew. I was 7 months pregnant, unmarried, and completely alone. The baby's father had vanished the moment I told him I was expecting. Since then, I had spent months enduring judgment from relatives, whispers from neighbors, and lectures from my parents. Still, I held on to hope. I believed that when Christmas arrived, my family would finally put aside their disappointment and support me. As I stepped into the dining room that evening, the table sparkled with candles and polished silverware. My brother sat across from me, avoiding eye contact. My aunts and uncles chatted quietly while Christmas music played in the background. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then my father stood from his chair and cleared his throat. The room instantly fell silent. His serious expression made my stomach tighten. "There's something we need to discuss," he said. I already knew the topic. My pregnancy had become the center of every family conversation. My mother folded her hands on the table and stared down at her plate. My father continued, "Your mother and I have found a solution." A solution? The word made me uneasy. "What kind of solution?" I asked carefully. He exchanged a glance with my mother. "A respectable couple has agreed to adopt your baby after the birth." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. My heart pounded. "You arranged what?" "They can provide opportunities you never could," my mother said quietly. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to object. Nobody did. The silence hurt more than their words. "No," I said firmly. My father's jaw tightened. "You haven't thought this through." "I have," I replied. "This is my child." His face darkened. Then he delivered the sentence that changed my life forever. "You have 2 choices." The room became perfectly still. "You either give the baby up for adoption," he paused, "or you are no longer part of this family." The words felt like a physical blow. I stared at him in disbelief. "You're serious?" Completely. Tears burned in my eyes. I turned toward my mother. "Mom." She finally looked at me. "We're trying to save you from making a mistake." "No," I whispered. "You're asking me to abandon my child." Nobody defended me. Not my brother, not my relatives, no one. A small kick suddenly pressed against my stomach. My daughter. Even before she was born, she seemed to remind me she was there, waiting, depending on me. I placed both hands over my belly and felt an unexpected calm. The fear disappeared. The doubt disappeared. I knew exactly what I had to do. Slowly, I stood from my chair. Then I looked directly at my father. "If those are my choices," I said, my voice shaking but steady, "I choose my daughter." Gasps echoed around the table. My father pointed toward the front door. "Then leave." The room blurred through my tears. I grabbed my coat and small suitcase. No one stopped me. No one followed me. As I stepped into the freezing Christmas night, snowflakes fell softly around me. Behind me, the front door slammed shut. At that moment, I lost my family, but I kept my daughter. And though I didn't know it yet, that choice would one day change everything. The night my parents disowned me was the coldest night of my life. Snow covered the streets as I walked away from the only home I had ever known. My suitcase felt heavy, but nothing weighed more than the pain in my heart. Every step seemed impossible. I was 7 months pregnant, alone, and uncertain about what would happen next. I spent that first night on the couch of a friend from college, Sarah, who welcomed me without asking questions. The moment she saw my tear-stained face, she wrapped me in a blanket and told me I could stay as long as I needed. That simple act of kindness nearly broke me. For weeks, I tried not to think about my parents. I focused on preparing for my baby's arrival. I found a tiny apartment with peeling paint and old furniture. It wasn't much, but it was mine. 3 weeks later, my daughter was born. The moment the nurse placed her in my arms, the world seemed to stop. She had tiny fingers, soft brown hair, and the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen. "Hello, Emma," I whispered. At that moment, every sacrifice became worth it. The first few years were incredibly difficult. Money was always tight. During the day, I worked at a small coffee shop. At night, I cleaned office buildings after everyone had gone home. Some nights I slept only 3 or 4 hours before starting again. There were times when I skipped meals, so Emma would have enough food. There were moments when I cried quietly after putting her to bed, terrified that I might fail her. But every morning, she gave me a reason to keep going. Her smile could erase an entire day of exhaustion. Her laughter filled our tiny apartment with warmth. And every time she wrapped her little arms around my neck and said, "I love you, Mommy," I felt stronger. Years passed. Emma grew into a bright, curious child who loved books and asked endless questions. One evening, when she was 8 years old, she looked up from her homework and asked something I had been dreading. "Mom, do I have grandparents?" My heart tightened. I could have filled her mind with anger. I could have told her how they abandoned us. But I refused to pass that pain on to her. "Yes," I answered gently. "Where are they?" I paused. "They made some choices a long time ago." She nodded thoughtfully. Then she smiled. "Well, they're missing out." I laughed through tears. She had no idea how right she was. As Emma grew older, I began taking small catering jobs on weekends. I discovered that I loved cooking for events and celebrations. Word spread quickly, and soon I had more customers than I could handle alone. What started as a side job became a business, then a successful company, then several companies. Slowly, the life that once seemed impossible began to take shape. We moved into a beautiful home. Emma attended an excellent school. For the first time in years, I felt secure. Yet through all those years, one thing never changed. My parents never called, never wrote, never apologized. Not once. It was as if they had erased us from their lives. Eventually, I stopped waiting. I stopped hoping. I accepted that the family I lost at Christmas was never coming back. What I didn't know was that 20 years after that snowy night, fate would bring them back to my doorstep. And when it did, everything would change. 20 years passed faster than I ever imagined. The frightened young woman who had walked out of her parents' house on Christmas Eve was gone. In her place stood a successful business owner, a proud mother, and someone who had learned how to survive without the people who were supposed to love her most. Emma was now 20 years old. She was everything I had hoped she would become: intelligent, compassionate, hardworking, and confident. She was studying business at university, while helping me manage parts of our growing event company. More importantly, she had a kind heart. Every time I looked at her, I was reminded that choosing her had been the best decision of my life. It was a rainy afternoon just a few days before Christmas when the past suddenly returned. I was reviewing contracts in my home office when the doorbell rang. I glanced at the clock. I wasn't expecting anyone. Thinking it might be a delivery, I walked to the front door and opened it. The moment I saw the people standing there, my breath caught in my throat. My parents. For several seconds, nobody spoke. They looked older than I remembered, much older. My father's once. Dark hair had turned completely gray. His shoulders seemed smaller, weighed down by years. My mother looked tired and fragile, her eyes filled with emotions I couldn't immediately recognize. Shock, regret, shame. "Hello, Sarah," my mother finally whispered. Hearing my name from her lips after 20 years felt strange. I simply stared. Neither of them had called, neither had written. 2 decades of silence stood between us. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My father lowered his eyes. We were hoping we could talk. The words felt almost unreal. After 20 years, they wanted to talk. I considered closing the door. Part of me wanted to, but another part wanted answers. So I stepped aside. "Come in." They entered slowly, looking around my home, the elegant furniture, the family photographs, the signs of a life I had built without them. I noticed my mother staring at a framed picture of Emma and me on vacation. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "She's beautiful," she whispered. I didn't respond. We sat in the living room. The silence became uncomfortable. Finally, my father spoke. "We made mistakes." I waited. For years I had imagined hearing those words. But now that they had finally arrived, they felt incomplete. Because mistakes were forgetting birthdays. Mistakes were arriving late to dinner. What they had done was a choice, a deliberate one. "What do you want?" I asked. My father exchanged a nervous glance with my mother. Then the truth emerged. His retirement savings were nearly gone. Medical expenses had piled up. My brother's failed business had left the family drowning in debt. They were struggling. Desperate, and somehow they had learned about my success. My event company had become one of the largest in the region. Suddenly, the reason for their visit became painfully clear. They hadn't come because they missed me. They hadn't come because they wanted a relationship. They had come because they needed help. The realization hurt more than I expected. Before I could respond, footsteps sounded from the staircase. Emma entered the room carrying a laptop. She stopped when she saw the strangers. "Mom." Then she smiled politely. "Sorry, I didn't know we had guests." My parents turned toward her. The moment they realized who she was, their faces changed completely. This was the baby they had wanted me to give away. The child they had considered a mistake. Now she stood before them as a confident, successful young woman. My mother began crying. My father looked completely devastated. For the first time, they were forced to face the truth. The little girl they had rejected had become the greatest blessing of my life, and the regret in their eyes was impossible to hide. But what they didn't know was that the hardest conversation was still ahead of us. The room remained silent after Emma sat beside me. My parents couldn't take their eyes off her. For 20 years, they had lived with an image of a mistake, a child they believed would ruin my future and destroy our family's reputation. Now that child was sitting across from them, confident, educated, kind, and successful. The reality was impossible for them to ignore. Emma looked at me curiously. "Mom, who are they?" I took a slow breath. The moment I had imagined for years had finally arrived. "These are your grandparents." Emma's eyes widened slightly. For a second, she looked surprised. Then she glanced at my parents and offered a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you." The kindness in her voice only seemed to make them feel worse. My mother began wiping tears from her cheeks. "You're so beautiful," she whispered. Emma thanked her politely, but there was no emotional connection. How could there be? They were strangers. 20 years had stolen that opportunity. My father cleared his throat. "We don't deserve your kindness." Neither Emma nor I responded, because he was right. After a few moments, he finally explained everything. The debts, the medical bills, the financial struggles, the fear of losing their home. By the time he finished speaking, the room felt heavy. Then he looked directly at me. We need help. There it was, the real reason they had come. Not because they wanted to rebuild a relationship. Not because they wanted to know their granddaughter, because they needed something. For years I had imagined this moment. I had pictured myself yelling, telling them to leave, making them feel the same pain they had caused me. But sitting beside Emma changed everything. She had grown into a better person than bitterness would allow. And I realized that revenge didn't have to look like cruelty. I stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the garden. Snow had begun falling outside, just like it had on the night they threw me out. The memory returned instantly. The slammed door, the freezing air, the loneliness, the fear. I turned back toward them. 20 years ago, they had given me a choice. Give up my baby or lose my family. Today, life had given me a choice of my own. I could become like them. Or I could become better. I won't abandon you, I said, my mother's face filled with hope. My father looked relieved. But I wasn't finished. I won't write you a check either. Their expressions fell. I'll arrange professional financial assistance. I'll help you find medical support programs and housing resources. I'll make sure you're safe. My father lowered his head. But that's all. Yes, why? I looked at him calmly, because actions have consequences. Silence filled the room. You left me when I needed you most. I continued. You missed 20 years of birthdays, graduations, and memories. You don't get to erase that simply because you regret it now. My mother's shoulders shook as she cried. We were wrong. I know. For the first time, there was no anger in my voice. Only truth. Emma stood and gently took my hand. The same hand that had held hers through every struggle. Every victory, every difficult day, I smiled at her. Then I looked back at my parents. You know what the biggest surprise is. They waited. The baby you wanted me to give away became the reason I succeeded. Fresh tears filled my mother's eyes. My father couldn't even look at me. As they prepared to leave, they paused at the door. For the first time in 20 years, my father spoke words I never thought I'd hear. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it, but some apologies arrived too late to change the past. After they left, Emma wrapped her arms around me. Are you okay? I smiled and looked out at the falling snow. Yes. Because at that moment, I finally understood something important. The sweetest revenge wasn't making them suffer. It was building a beautiful life without them, and proving that the child they rejected was the greatest gift I had ever received. For the first time in 20 years, the pain was gone, and all that remained was peace.